Hi, everyone, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the country. My name is Emily Halter, and I am the Industrial Stormwater Program Lead at US EPA, and wanted to welcome you to the webinar today. I know there's still some folks coming in, but there's a lot of information to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Today I'm going to be talking about the proposed 2020 multi-sector general permit for industrial stormwater discharges. There is a lot of information that I want to cover today, so please, please follow along, and if you have any questions, please submit them to the questions box. We're going to have a Q&A at the end of this webinar. If you have any issues with the webcast itself, on the screen here is the GoToWebinar support website. Due to the pandemic and everybody doing a lot of telework lately, I think GoToWebinar is having a lot of calls, so you may experience longer wait times if you do call. So there is a prompt for FAQs on the website if you have issues. And if all else fails and you aren't able to follow along with this webcast, we have a previously recorded webcast from last month, which covers the same content as this webinar, which is posted on our website. And additionally, we will post this webcast on the same website within 1 to 2 weeks if you missed something. So before we get started, I have a slide from our lawyers, just a disclaimer that the language in this presentation is not the official proposal for the MSGP. We've attempted to be as accurate as possible in the contents of this presentation, but it is not the official proposed permit, and to the extent that there's any differences between this presentation and the proposal is the thing that governs. So again, this is more of a summary and an introduction to the permit, but for all of the context for the proposal, you'll need to look at the actual permit documents. And I'm just waiting for the slides to catch up. To begin with the presentation, I wanted to talk about a couple of key messages that I'd like everyone to really keep in mind as we go through the PowerPoint. The first is that most of these new proposed requirements in the permit were informed by two different drivers. The first being a 2016 settlement agreement that EPA entered into with environmental organizations and industry interveners on the current 2015 MSGP. And in that settlement agreement, there were about 8 terms that EPA agreed to, several of which we agreed to propose for comment in this new 2020 MSGP. So there are several items that we've added to the proposal that came from this settlement agreement. One of the terms from that settlement agreement was that EPA would fund a National Academies study which reviewed the Industrial Stormwater Program, reviewed the 2015 MSGP and the history of the program, where we are now, and made recommendations for improvements to the program. And as part of the settlement agreement, we agreed to consider all the recommendations that came out of that study and include several in our proposed permit. So those are really the two main drivers for a lot of things that I'm going to talk about today. Secondly, the purpose of every proposed requirement is ultimately to minimize discharge of pollutants in stormwater from industrial activity. I'm not going to go into the detail and rationale in depth for why we've proposed different options in the permit and different provisions that we're requesting comment on. A lot of that is documented in the fact sheet for the permit, so I encourage everyone to read that. Really, I just wanted to talk about what we're proposing and what the changes are in relation to the 2015 MSGP, not really going into the detailed documentation for each of those. Third, keep in mind that not all of the requirements I'm going to talk about today will apply to every facility. And even if they apply to your facility, they might not apply all of the time, and you'll see examples of that throughout the presentation. Fourth, like I mentioned before, this presentation is really just an overview of the proposed permit. I really encourage everyone, if you decide to comment on the permit, you'll need to read the permit, read the request for comment, read the fact sheet to really understand the context for all of the proposed requirements. This presentation is really an introduction, an overview, and a guide for what's in the proposal. And lastly, we need your help. We are seeking your comments on the proposal. We are seeking your input on all the things we're proposing, all of the requests for comment, and also providing additional data on pollutants, control measures, and costs. So those are things that we're seeking your input on as well. So what's ahead? Like I said, I have a lot to cover. This presentation will probably go over time. I know we're supposed to end at 2:30 Eastern time. From the last presentation, there was a lot of information to cover, and I do want to leave room for Q&A at the end. So hopefully you can hang on. I'll try to get through everything as much as possible and get to your questions at the end. But I anticipate we'll probably go over by a number of minutes towards the end, just because there's so much to cover. The first thing I wanted to do, given that we have a variety of audience members on the webinar today, is run a couple of polls. So I'm going to send those out now. The first thing is I'd like to know how many people are viewing the webinar. So if you're, this question usually is more applicable when we're not all teleworking, for folks that are in the office with a number of their colleagues, but I still decided to go ahead and run the poll. So if you're by yourself, go ahead and vote, but if you're with other colleagues, just let us know how many people you're with. Okay, great. As expected, most people are just them, including myself. And so I'm going to send out another poll just asking if you, the viewer, are a current MSGP permittee. All right, that looks good. So about half of you are, and half of you are not. Thanks so much. Okay, so lastly, I'd like to know what topic you guys are most interested in hearing about today. So the options, the things that I'm going to cover and the options you're seeing are eligibility and authorization. So eligibility requirements like those relating to CERCLA, the new proposed coal tar sealant, control measures, monitoring. We have some proposed changes to sectors that are required to monitor, some universal benchmark monitoring requirements, and then the last option is additional implementation measures, and that's an update to the corrective action procedures for benchmark exceedances. So just trying to get a sense for what folks are most interested in. If you could vote, please. Okay, great. So it looks like a lot of folks are interested in the monitoring and secondly, the additional implementation measures. Okay, thank you so much for voting. So again, the outline of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the regulatory background, go over some things with the expiring 2015 MSGP, especially because we have about half of our audience members as current permittees, and a lot of their consultants are likely on as well. I have one slide to talk about COVID-19 information, which I'm sure you're all interested in, and then I'm going to get into proposed changes, requests for comment, etc. So I've actually added a little bit of information since the last presentation, which is why I think we might go over time a little bit. But I did just want to mention that I do have a team of folks that are helping me with the webinar today. like many of you, we are all remote, so we're all working from home. So please just bear with us. We're trying to coordinate this webinar in 4 different locations over the internet. So if we have any issues, please just bear with us. But again, thanks for being with us today, and we're really happy that we could continue hosting this webinar as scheduled. So getting into the permit background, I know many of you are probably very familiar with the structure of the permit and the regulatory background, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, how does EPA regulate industrial stormwater? If you can kind of look at this graphic with the triangle, at the bottom we have our statute, the Clean Water Act, Section 402P, which is really the foundation of our program. It's where Congress directed EPA to regulate stormwater discharges associated with industrial activity. On top of that, in the middle, we have our regulations, which give more detail to our program in 40 CFR 122.26B14. That's where industrial discharges from industrial activity is defined, and that's where 11 categories of industrial activity are also defined. And on top of that, we have the permits, of course, the multi-sector general permit. EPA has issued the MSGP 4 times, and this new permit will be the 5th time. So the permit itself is really the implementing vehicle of those regulations, and the regulations implement the statute. So you can kind of see how they're all connected. This is the structure of our MSGP. Again, this presentation is not focused on ongoing requirements of the MSGP. I really wanted to focus today on the proposal, but just to make sure, we're all familiar with what's in the permit itself. I like to look at the permit as sort of these 4 bins. So prepare, get covered, take action, and follow up. To prepare, you need to make sure that the facility meets the different eligibility conditions to be covered under this particular permit, and also develop a stormwater pollution prevention plan, the SWIP. To get covered, facilities need to submit a notice of intent and receive authorization usually 30 days after they submit the notice of intent for EPA's MSGP. Different actions that need to be taken to comply with the permit are installing the control measures to meet the effluent limits, those BMPs, conducting various types of monitoring under the permit. We have effluent limitation monitoring, impaired waters monitoring, and benchmark monitoring, also conducting inspections. For follow-up items, completing any corrective actions when there's an issue, and new to this proposal is this AIM, additional implementation measures, so that's corrective actions for benchmark exceedances, and then completing any reporting that's required. There is an exclusion from needing to get a multi-sector general permit coverage, and that's called the conditional exclusion for no exposure. And what that means is if all your industrial activities and materials are inside, protected by a storm-resistant shelter, so you're not being exposed to rain or snow melt or any type of runoff, then you don't need to get covered under an MSGP. You still have to go through a no exposure checklist and submit a certification online. So that's in the same system that you would submit the NOI, you would submit the NEC, and basically you would fill in information about your facility, go through the checklist to certify that none of those activities or materials are exposed to stormwater, sign it and submit it. That NEC is, it's every 5 years, and it's not on the same timeline as the MSGP. So even though the MSGP is on a 5-year term as well, the timelines aren't necessarily synchronized. So just for those folks that are thinking about a no exposure. EPA's MSGP applies in a couple parts of the country. So where states aren't authorized to implement the NPDES program for industrial stormwater, EPA issues the MSGP for those areas. And that includes 4 states, Idaho until 2021, when Idaho will assume the NPDES program, New Mexico, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and then DC, Puerto Rico, all of the territories, most of the territories, and most Indian country land. In addition to those areas, those are the teal areas that you're seeing on the map here. We do, the permit is available in a couple of other places, so Washington, Colorado, Vermont, and Delaware for federal facilities, and then a couple of places in Oklahoma and Texas for certain oil and gas activities. Oh, it looks like the poll is sharing on your guys' screen right now. One second. So the expiring 2015 MSGP, I added this information because we did get a lot of questions on last month's webinar. So I wanted to go over some really key milestones and dates that I know folks will be interested in. So the proposed 2020 MSGP was published in the Federal Register, and it's open for public comment. That published on March 2nd. 2020, and the comment period will end 60 days after that date, so that makes it May 1st. I will note that EPA has received 4 requests to extend the comment period, and the agency is still considering those requests to extend the comment period. If we do extend the comment period, it may just we may just manually change the date in the docket, or we may issue a Federal Register notice announcing that. But either way, we would let everybody know, you know, either via email or listservs. We would email attendees to our webinars, current permittees, everything. So we would make sure that folks know if we decided to extend the comment period. But currently, the comment period does end on May 1st of this year. So the 2015 MSGP does expire on June 4th. So if you guys can look at the dates, you can see that our proposal is still very active, and it will not be issued by the time the 2015 MSGP expires. What that means is that the 2015 MSGP will be administratively continued. This means that existing facilities will remain covered and new facilities cannot be covered. I'll cover that in more detail in the following slides. Currently, the final 2020 MSGP needs to be signed and published by November 12th, 2020. So that was due to a settlement agreement deadline. We agreed in the settlement agreement that we would finalize the permit 9 months after we signed the proposal. So we actually signed the proposal in February 12th, and so that means we have to sign the final 9 months after that, making that November. That is the current deadline right now based on the settlement agreement. For existing facilities, that means that if we were to finalize the permit by November 12th, you would have 90 days to submit a new NOI. So that means by February 12th of 2021, that would be 90 days after we issued the final permit. For new facilities to get covered under the new MSGP, you would have 30 days prior to commencing your discharges. So that's similar to the existing permit. So about 30 days before, you need to submit your NOI. But for existing facilities, you have sort of this 90-day grace period by which you would need to submit your NOI. So more information for existing facilities. Again, the current permit expires June 4th, and it will be administratively continued per the EPA and 40 CFR 122.6. If you look in the permit in part 122, there's a whole section about administratively continued permits. So what this means is that if you obtain authorization to discharge under the current permit prior to the expiration, any discharges authorized under that permit will automatically remain covered after the expiration date until you are authorized for coverage under a new permit. So basically when you submit an NOI, when EPA issues a new permit, or you submit an NOT, or you get an individual permit. I have these grayed out because most of the time these 2 and 3 aren't really the case. Most folks are looking to continue their coverage. So basically once EPA administratively continues the permit, you'll remain covered until we issue a new permit and you are authorized for coverage by submitting an NOI. Continuing on, for existing facilities, you must continue to comply with the permit. So that means all the inspections, monitoring, corrective actions, any reporting, etc. No other action is needed from you as a facility to remain covered under the permit. So this is automatic continuance of permit coverage. We'll notify all existing permittees via the NPDES e-reporting tool, or NET, as you probably know, where you submit your NOI and your annual report, all the forms. And your coverage status in NET will automatically be changed to administratively continued. That means your permit coverage is, it's still active, but it's administratively continued under the permit. And like I said, once the new MSGP is issued, you'll have about 90 days to submit a new NOI under the the new permit, excuse me. So for new facilities, the case for new facilities is a little bit different. New facilities are basically those without prior permit coverage will not be able to obtain permit coverage under the administratively continued permit. So I'd like to note that any NOI submitted prior to June 3rd, 2020 at 11:59 Eastern Time will be processed. So if you have stuff in draft right now, please, make sure you finish that up, get it certified, get it submitted as soon as possible. We're taking submissions up until the very last date to make sure that folks, we can get as many folks covered under this existing permit as possible. So if you're a consultant, work with your permittees. If you're a permittee, make sure that you get your drafts in as soon as possible. We're having a new form added to the NET system for new facilities or facilities without prior permit coverage that we're calling the intent to operate, that should say operate, not intent to operator, in accordance with the 2015 MSGP. So because we not like another acronym, we're calling that the ITO form. This is not the same as a notice of intent. It's really just letting EPA know that your facility, which didn't have permit coverage before, intends to comply with the administratively continued permit as much as possible. Before, when EPA had to administratively continue the MSGP, new facilities that needed to operate in accordance with the permit would send in a paper form to EPA, and we would keep track of them that way. To help streamline things for not only operators, but also EPA, we've decided to create a new form in the NET system. It's basically very similar to the NOI form. It asks the same information for the most part. And basically it's letting EPA know that the facility exists, here's the information, and that you intend to comply for the most part with the administratively continued permit. The hope is that when we do issue a new permit, those facilities can take their ITO form and convert it to an NOI. You can review that information, certify it, and submit it, and then seek active coverage under the permit. So that's the plan for now. We're working on developing this form. So once the permit expires on June 3rd, the NOI will no longer be available, and the intent to operate form will then be available for those facilities that didn't have coverage. So again, I can't stress this enough. If you intend to get coverage, if you have forms in draft, make sure you get them in prior to this June 3rd at 11:59 date. Some information on COVID-19. I know that this is a very interesting, strange, and difficult time. I know facilities are concerned about their compliance obligations with the different stay-at-home orders and travel bans. So I just wanted to highlight some of the resources that EPA has put out regarding COVID-19. So on March 26th, we issued a temporary enforcement policy related to COVID-19. Rather than trying to paraphrase what's in the policy and what you need to do, I've really just highlighted a couple of key points and really encourage you to actually read the memos themselves, because they're very detailed and give explicit direction on what to do. So the bottom line is everyone should make every effort possible to comply with your environmental compliance obligations. If that's not reasonably practicable, facilities, should follow the procedures in the memo. And like I said, it's outlined in a couple of detailed steps. Additionally, especially related to NPDES permittees, on March 31st, EPA issued a temporary advisory for NPDES reporting. So that's specific to anyone that would have monitoring requirements under the MSGP. Again, where you can report, you're expected to report when you do have data for the monitoring period. If you have data that's missing, or if you can't collect data due to COVID-19, set forth in the temporary policy, so this temporary policy that I just talked about, then you can follow procedures that are outlined in this advisory. So each of these resources and a couple of others can be found on this website here. And also, if you just Google COVID-19 EPA policy, a couple of these websites will come up, so you can easily find it. But here is the direct link to that website. Okay, getting into the proposed changes. I first wanted to start off with this slide talking about proposed changes, because I get a lot of questions asking, hey, my facility isn't located in an area where EPA's permit applies, but what's going to happen with my state permit once EPA finalizes their MSGP? The answer to that is it depends. States have the discretion to implement any requirement they would like, but they don't have to mimic EPA's MSGP. Even though we acknowledge that many states do use EPA's MSGP as a model for their own state MSGPs. So, we did a rough analysis of which state MSGPs mirror EPA's MSGP, just to give folks an idea. So there are substantial number of states that are very similar. There are some that are pretty identical, and then there are some that are kind of different. So it really just depends on what your state decides to do. I would just encourage you, when the state does come out with a new proposal, if their permit is expiring, to look at that. But right now, we don't necessarily have an idea of what states are going to do what. So it really is up to the state what they decide to implement. They aren't obligated to implement any of these changes that EPA is proposing in our permit. So with that, I do want to start going into the proposed changes that we have in our draft permit, starting with the eligibility and authorization. And the way I've organized each of these slides is on the left-hand side is a summary of what's in the current 2015 MSGP, and on the right-hand side is talking about what's new in the proposal. And I've tried to underline the differences between the two. Again, this is very high level. It's very much a summary. But in the bottom part of the slide, just going to, what is the bottom line? What is it in plain language? What do you need to think about? So that's the way all of the rest of the slides are organized. So that's how I'm going to go through each of the proposed changes. So the first one I want to talk about is about expanding the CERCLA eligibility criterion to all regions. In the 2015 MSGP, operators only in Region 10 discharging to certain CERCLA sites are ineligible for coverage unless the region reviews the SWIP ahead of time. So those specific facilities have to submit their SWIP to the region reviews it, looks at the controls, make sure they're sufficient to ensure that discharges meet water quality standards and are not recontaminating those CERCLA sites that have been cleaned up. In the proposal, we're proposing that this eligibility criterion apply to operators discharging to certain CERCLA sites in all regions. So that would expand it outside of Region 10. And basically the bottom line is, as I just said, this would be applicable for those facilities in all areas where the MSGP applies, not just Region 10 anymore. So that is the eligibility criterion related to the CERCLA site expansion. Next eligibility criterion that we're proposing is related to the use of coal tar seal coat. We don't have anything equivalent in the current permit. For the proposal, we're proposing for comment that this eligibility criterion is for operators who, during their coverage under the MSGP, will use coal tar sealant to initially seal or reseal pavement and thereby discharge PAHs in stormwater. Those operators are not eligible for coverage under the MSGP, and they must either eliminate that discharge from those areas or apply for an individual permit. We don't look at this as a ban on the use of coal tar seal coat. You're still allowed to use it, but you would have to control those discharges from those areas of your facility. And also, this does not apply to areas where industrial activities are not occurring. So for example, if you have a parking lot for your administrative building, something like that, your industrial activity is not occurring there. So it's only applicable to those paved areas where you have industrial activity and the potential for stormwater to wash over those sealants and have a discharge that contains PAHs. So in that case, you would have to, again, capture those discharges, eliminate them somehow, or you can use an individual permit to have some more individualized stormwater controls for that discharge. Another thing that we're proposing for NOI authorization is an extended NOI review time for facilities with a pending enforcement action. Under the current 2015 MSGP, EPA, like I mentioned at the beginning, holds all facilities NOIs for 30 days. This allows EPA and other agencies, the Endangered Species Service agencies, the opportunity to review the facility's NOI. This is not a public comment period. It's more for facilities to submit their information to the agency. We make sure that everything looks right, everything seems eligible. The Endangered Species Services have an opportunity to review that part of the NOI to see if there are any concerns. Sometimes facilities' NOIs are put on hold just to resolve any concerns, and then usually they go through. For the proposal, we're requesting comment on whether EPA should hold a facility's NOI for 30 additional days, so that would be 60 days total, for facilities that were not previously covered under the MSGP, so basically if they were operating without a permit, and they also have a pending industrial stormwater related enforcement action. So this total of 60-day NOI hold time would apply to a very small subset of facilities, basically facilities that were not covered before, they didn't have a permit, and they have some sort of pending enforcement action against the facility. Also related to authorization is that we're proposing facilities post a sign about their permit coverage. We don't have an equivalent in the MSGP currently, but if you're familiar with EPA's construction general permit, there is a requirement in that to post a sign of permit coverage, and many other NPDES permits have this requirement. So we're proposing that facilities post a sign detailing their permit coverage at a publicly accessible location and includes information about how to contact EPA if there's stormwater pollution observed in the discharge, and how to obtain the SWIP from the facility or from EPA. We didn't make too many proposed changes to the control measures portion of the permit. The one thing that we did add was to encourage facilities to consider implementing enhanced measures to mitigate impacts from major storm events. So we're looking at things like structural improvements, enhanced pollution prevention measures, and other mitigation measures. The permit gives a number of examples for facilities that are located in areas that could be impacted by stormwater discharges from extreme flooding. So, knowing that there's, increased hurricanes, there have been these historic flood events, there's a lot of concern that we're having stormwater discharges from these extreme weather events that are discharging a lot of pollutants out into the environment, out into the communities. And so part of what we did with the proposal was have a requirement that facilities consider these additional enhanced control measures if they are in a high-risk area. We did request comment, and you can take a look at that in Part 2118, as I've detailed on the slide in the upper right-hand corner. There's a request for comment on how EPA might identify where those facilities are located. So one idea is if they were in the FEMA flood map, identified 100-year floodplain, for example. So we're looking for some input on this proposed requirement as well. And some examples that we gave in the permit are to elevate materials, for example, above the base flood elevation, temporarily reduce outdoor storage if you know a hurricane is coming, or delay deliveries of materials if you can, if there's a major storm event that's coming that is expected to have high flood conditions. We proposed a number of new changes to the monitoring in the permit. The first one I wanted to talk about was expanding benchmark monitoring for all facilities. So in the current permit, benchmark monitoring only applies to about half of our MSGP facilities. The other 45% don't have any benchmark monitoring requirements. This was an issue that was raised by that National Academies study that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that really we're not collecting any data on half of our facilities, so we don't know how effective their controls are. We don't know necessarily what's going on in terms of stormwater control effectiveness, and so having additional monitoring data would be really useful, not only for EPA to understand how effective our permit is being, but also, the permittee having real-time data to understand how their controls are doing and controlling pollutants in their discharge. So we're proposing that all facilities that are covered under the MSGP have now universal benchmark monitoring of pH, total suspended solids, and COD on a quarterly basis throughout the permit term. So that means that facilities that did not have benchmark monitoring before will have these three parameters. For facilities that had benchmark monitoring but didn't have all of these three parameters, for example, maybe they only had pH, they would now be required to monitor for TSS and COD as well. Same thing, if you had 2 out of the 3, you would have the third as your benchmark monitoring requirement. We had some proposed changes to the impaired waters monitoring requirements in the permit. So in the 2015 MSGP, operators discharging to impaired waters were required to monitor once a year for all pollutants causing impairments to the water body, and can discontinue monitoring if the pollutant wasn't detected or expected to be in the discharge. As part of our settlement agreement, we had specific updates to this part of the permit that we had to propose. So the change that we're proposing is that operators discharging to those impaired waters must monitor once per year, only for pollutants that are both causing the impairment and associated with the industrial activity. So not just the ones causing impairment, but that are kind of overlapping on both of these lists. So potentially narrowing the list of pollutants that you need to monitor for, or benchmarks. And then only after 3 years of monitoring, if it's not detected, can you discontinue for the remainder of the permit term. So basically the bottom line is facilities discharging to impaired waters would need to monitor for 3 years instead of just 1. So you're adding 2 additional years of monitoring. So that's 2 more samples because it's annual monitoring. For those pollutants that are associated with your activity or are benchmarks that are also causing the impairment, again, instead of just monitoring for 1 year. We are also proposing to update some benchmarks and add flexibility and suspend others based on the latest toxicity information. So the National Academies study identified some benchmarks that were outdated based on water quality criteria and toxicity data. And as EPA's regular reissuance process, we do review the benchmarks that we have, and if there are any new water quality criteria that have been issued, that we do update the benchmarks accordingly. So in the proposal, we're proposing to or requesting comment on revising selenium, arsenic, aluminum, and cadmium based on new final EPA water quality criteria. We're also proposing to remove magnesium and iron due to some lack of documented toxicity and lack of documented effects, and then allowing for some site-specific flexibility for copper exceedances. And that was one thing that the National Academy study highlighted. So again, just revising the benchmarks as usual, but then looking at some flexibilities and removing some others. I meant to put the slide before the last one, but this is going back to the universal benchmark monitoring. So as I mentioned, benchmark monitoring for those universal parameters are being proposed to be monitored on a quarterly basis throughout the entire permit term. Currently, in the 2015 MSGP, benchmark monitoring can be discontinued after 1 year if those 4-quarter annual average is below the benchmark threshold. And this is really something that the Academy study pointed out as well, is that not only did we not have monitoring data for half of our facilities, but benchmark monitoring requirements could be discontinued after 1 year. So for the remainder of the permit term, if you're covered for the entire permit term, for the first year, you're collecting data on your the effectiveness of your controls through benchmark monitoring. But if you discontinue for the remainder, years 2 through 5, you don't have any data coming in. And so having that data throughout the permit term gives you more real-time information that you can react to as a facility. It also gives EPA more data on the facilities throughout the permit term, so we can evaluate how facilities are doing, how our requirements and how the controls are being put into place and complied with. We're also proposing to add benchmark monitoring data for some sectors. So this is in addition to the universal benchmarks that I talked about before, which applies to all facilities. This is specific to certain sectors. So in the 2015 MSGP, there aren't any benchmarks for Sector I, oil and gas, Sector P, land, transportation, and Sector R, ship and boat building. There is some documented potential for pollutant discharges from these sectors, and so EPA is proposing to add different parameters for benchmark monitoring to these sectors, which I listed out here on the right-hand side of the slide. And what this means, approximately 530 facilities would now have these sector-specific benchmark monitoring requirements. So that's 530 for all 3 of these sectors counted up. So moving on to additional implementation measures. Like you know, we love our acronyms, so we decided to make a new one. So we're referring to this as AIM. AIM is an update and enhancement to the corrective action procedures for benchmark exceedances. So we're no longer calling the follow-up actions for benchmark exceedances corrective action. We're now referring to that as additional implementation measures, or AIM. Corrective action procedures for other triggers, for example, if there's an exceedance of an ELG or stormwater control needs repair or replace, those corrective actions still exist. But for benchmark exceedances, the follow-up procedures are now called AIM. So in the 2015 MSGP, if a benchmark is exceeded, operators must review their controls, review your SWIP, see if you need to make any changes, and if modifications are necessary, you need to make them, and then continue monitoring if there's no exceedance. In the proposed 2020 MSGP, we've developed a three-level, three-tier protocol for benchmark exceedances. So for the first tier, it's very similar to the existing permit. So in Tier 1, if benchmarks are exceeded by certain low thresholds, then you need to review control measures, review your SWIP, take those necessary modifications and continue monitoring until there's no exceedance. If benchmarks are exceeded or continually exceeded from the previous year by certain moderate thresholds, then facilities need to implement all feasible controls in EPA's sector-specific fact sheets and continue monitoring until there's no exceedance. And for Tier 3, it's sort of the next level. So if benchmarks are exceeded or repeatedly exceeded again by certain high thresholds, then facilities will be required to install permanent structural source controls and treatment controls, or as an alternative, consider infiltration. So the bottom line is facilities have to implement more robust controls for continued or significant exceedances. We do have several exceptions to this protocol. Two exceptions that are continuing on from the previous permit, or the existing permit, I would say, are those coming from natural background sources. If your exceedance is due solely to natural background sources, you can document that, and that's an exception for complying with AIM. Also, if you have runoff from another entity or another source, those are still available, in addition to two more for a catastrophic event. And if your exceedances are not contributing to a water quality standards exceedance, there's specific instructions for how to document that. You will provide that to EPA, and if approved, then you would not need to comply with AIM. So I have several slides on AIM because it is such a new part of the permit, and it's pretty detailed. So I want to make sure I cover that completely. So I put together this graphic to try to help folks understand what AIM looks like and the different steps and actions that need to be taken. So on the left-hand side, you have the different tiers starting from 1 going to 2 and 3. In the teal color, we have the triggers. The orange color is the responses. So these are the required actions. In the gray, you have the deadlines for those actions. And then in sort of the light gray over here, you have the exceptions. So for Tier 1, the trigger, like I said, is if the benchmark is exceeded by a certain low threshold. I'm going to talk about what each of these low, moderate, and high thresholds are in the coming slides. So I'll get to that. But basically, if the benchmark is exceeded by a low threshold, then you need to review those stormwater control measures, implement any additional control measures, or modify the control measures, and then continue monitoring. And that would be required within 14 days, and if infeasible, you would have 45 days. Like I mentioned, the two exceptions that are still available are from natural background sources and run-on. Moving up to Tier 2, if a benchmark is exceeded or continually exceeded from the first level by a certain moderate threshold, then those facilities need to look at Appendix Q of the proposed permit. That's where all the feasible stormwater control measures are found in the EPA fact sheets. So looking at all of those, implementing them, and then continuing to monitor. That also is required within 14 days, and if infeasible, 45 days. The exceptions that are available, again, continuing from AIM Tier 1 are the natural background and run-on. And then for AIM Tier 2, if something was a single aberration, if it was a catastrophic event, an act of God, for some reason, there's an exceedance, you can document that, and you would not have to follow the procedures for AIM Tier 2. For AIM Tier 3, here at the top, looking at the trigger, if the benchmark is exceeded pretty egregiously, or it's continually exceeded by a certain high threshold, then at this point, facilities need to install permanent control measures. There is an option to consider infiltration if that's appropriate, and continue monitoring. And that would be required within 30 days, and if infeasible, 90 days. Again, the two exceptions from before are available. For AIM Tier 3, there's an additional exception that the discharge from the exceedance is not resulting in exceedance of water quality standards. So if you document that and submit that to EPA, that would be taken into consideration. So like I mentioned, I am going to talk about the different AIM triggers. not necessarily giving you numerical examples, but trying to help you visualize what those triggers might look like. In the permit, in the AIM section, we did provide some monitoring result examples that would and would not trigger the different AIM levels. So I'm really trying to walk folks through what that might look like so you can understand what the different triggers are. So for AIM Tier 1, like I mentioned, there are certain low exceedance triggers. So for example, if you have one annual average that's over the benchmark, you have year 1, your annual average is over the benchmark threshold. That means you're in AIM Tier 1 and you need to review your stormwater control measures. Similarly, a second trigger is if you have one sample that's 4 times over the benchmark, that means it's mathematically certain that you would exceed the annual average. So for example, looking at the graph, this is concentration based. So you have your 4-quarter samples here. The first sample is right about at the benchmark, and the second sample is way over the benchmark. You're now 4 times over the benchmark. That means in your second quarter sample, you've now triggered AIM Tier 1 and you need to take action at this time. So you know, at this point, the annual average is sort of a moot point because you're mathematically certain to exceed, so you need to take action and review those control measures at this point. So really giving you reason to react to your results earlier on rather than wait till the annual average is exceeded. Moving on to AIM Tier 2. AIM Tier 2 has 3 different triggers. Some of the triggers are repeated from AIM Tier 1 and similar for AIM Tier 3, you'll see. So the first trigger for AIM Tier 2 is you have a second annual average over the benchmark. If you look at the graph in year 1, maybe you triggered AIM Tier 1 here because your annual average is over. And then in a second year, you also have an annual average that's over the benchmark. So because you have 2, you're now in AIM Tier 2. For this trigger B, you would have a second sample in 2 years that's over 4 times the benchmark. So again, looking at the concentration and the mathematical certainty that you're going to exceed that annual average. So remember from the previous graph, that second sample was 4 times the benchmark, and now some time has passed. In the second year, you have a second sample that's over 4 times the benchmark. That means you're now in AIM Tier 2. And then looking at trigger C, for one sample that might be 8 times over the benchmark. So, this could be in the first year of monitoring. It doesn't necessarily have to be carryover from a previous year. Even if you have your first sample is below the benchmark, but somehow in the second sample, you have a result that's 8 times over the benchmark, that would trigger AIM Tier 2. So looking at this, maybe, it seems like something went wrong here. There might have been, like I said, a catastrophic event. This might be an example where you try to use that exception. And for AIM Tier 3, we have a continuation of the triggers from before. So again, you have a third annual average that's over the benchmark. You have your year 1 and 2 that were over, and now you have a third annual average that's over. There's really some work that needs to be done here with the stormwater controls, and those permanent controls would need to be implemented at this point. For trigger B, you have 2 samples in 3 years that are each over the benchmark. So you have, over the course of time of 3 years, you have 2 of these samples that are really high, 8 times over the benchmark. That means AIM Tier 3 is triggered. For trigger C, you have a third sample in 3 years that's 4 times over the benchmark. So this is a continuation of the triggers from AIM Tier 1 and Tier 2. So if this was your sample, your result from sample 2, and that was, from the first year, second year, you had another sample that was 4 times over the benchmark. And now again, over the course of 3 years, you have another sample that's 4 times over the benchmark. This means that you're now in AIM Tier 3. And lastly, if you have 4 consecutive samples over the benchmark and the average is more than 2 times the benchmark, you're also in Tier 3. So looking at the concentration for samples you have 4 samples that are over the benchmark and you're averaging them up, that's more than 2 times the benchmark. That means that you need to look at installing those permanent source controls and structural controls at this point. Again, hopefully these graphs are helpful. In the permit are actual numerical examples detailing some monitoring results that would and would not trigger the different aim levels, and it walks you through how the results actually trigger the different tiers over time, so you can really look at that in more detail. Other requests for comment. So in addition to all of the proposed changes that I talked about, we do have many other requests for comment. So this request for comment is not necessarily things that we've developed completely or proposed permit language for. We may just be asking for input or information. Sometimes a request for comment will accompany a proposed change. So if you look through the permit, the requests for comment are in red text. They're highlighted in that red, so you can see them very easily. I think we have 27 or 28 requests for comment. So make sure you look at each of those when you're preparing your comments. A couple ones I wanted to highlight. One is thinking about an eligibility criterion that is used in the construction general permit related to the use of cationic chemicals to help with controlling sediment. So for facilities that might have issues with sediment, if having an eligibility criterion related to the use of these cationic chemicals makes sense to also have in the MSGP if they're being used. Looking at a paper change NOI form, or thinking of making the acronym for the no exposure from NOE to NEC. Also asking about alternative approaches to benchmark monitoring. Currently, the benchmark monitoring is the best approach we have to evaluating stormwater control effectiveness on facilities, for a facility's control measures. So if there are other options and other things that EPA should be considering on how to evaluate that, that's something that we're thinking about and requesting comment on. There's also a significant request for comment on an inspection-only option in lieu of benchmark monitoring. I'm going to talk about that in more detail in the next slide. We're also asking about information about sectors and activities that might have polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon, PAH exposure, and in their discharges. That's something that is a concern to the agency. Also requesting comment on modifying the method for determining natural background contributions. And there was some confusion with some overlapping monitoring requirements for Sector G, so trying to clarify those a bit more. So take a look at the request for comment in the permit. The one that I wanted to highlight, because I think it'll be of interest to you and it's of interest to EPA, is request for comment 11, and that's on an inspection-only option in lieu of benchmark monitoring. This was something that the National Academies study highlighted, and EPA thinks it's a good idea, but I cleverly use this puzzle piece graphic here because I think there are a lot of pieces to this that we would need to figure out as a regulatory agency to make this work. Like I said, we think it's a really plausible idea, and it would reduce burden on entities that are low risk, but we need to try to figure out how to make this work. So basically, instead of requiring benchmark monitoring to a certain low risk facilities, they would have a professional inspection from some type of professional with some type of credentials, and that inspection report would then be submitted back to EPA, and it would include a number of things, and that would be the only requirement for that facility, and they wouldn't have to do any type of benchmark monitoring. This doesn't include impaired waters monitoring or ELG monitoring, I should mention, only benchmark monitoring. So key pieces to this are identifying what is the, who are those low risk facilities, and what's the criteria that we need to think about in identifying them. Also, what is the inspection frequency? This is proposed to be in lieu of benchmark monitoring, so looking at something that's going to be just as effective as benchmark monitoring in evaluating the effectiveness of the control. So is it every year of the permit term? Is it once per permit term? Is it every other year? We're looking for information about that. Also, what should be included in the inspection? The permit in the request for comment outlines a number of suggestions there. And then also the person that's conducting the inspection, what kind of credentials should they have? What kind of qualifications should they have? These are all areas of this request for comment that we're looking for input from the public on. So please take a look at that. For the proposed permit, although we did not propose this per se, we did actually cost it out and come up with some sort of structure for how it might look, just to understand what the cost implications might be. So what we did was we looked at the light manufacturing SIC codes in the regulations, and then took those facilities and those SIC codes, looked at having 2 inspections per permit term and having the inspections conducted by somebody like a PE or a PG. So these are the criteria that we use to develop this, solely for the purposes of costing it out and sort of seeing what it might look like. But this is a draft. I can't emphasize that enough, and we are looking for input on how we might develop these aspects of this inspection-only option. For costs, usually EPA for our general permits develops an estimated incremental cost. Developing a baseline cost for total compliance with the permit is really difficult for a number of reasons. So we usually, with our general permits, do a delta. Basically, if you can look at this equation here, what we do is we take what we have in the proposed permit, so that's the MSGP 2020. We take out what's existing in the 2015 MSGP, and what we're left with is all of the new and modified changes. So it's basically the cost differential from what is currently required to what we're proposing. And we have a cost estimate for that delta of about $2,300 per facility over the 5-year permit term. Now, I know there are a number of questions and considerations that go into a cost analysis. This is not a cost-benefit analysis. The permit is not a rulemaking, so we only develop a cost analysis, but there are a number of assumptions that go into the cost analysis that are detailed in the document. The cost analysis is a separate document that's in the docket. It goes through every proposed change and discusses the implications of that proposed change and the cost considerations. Some key assumptions that I really wanted to highlight and for folks to keep in mind as they read through the cost analysis is that many of the controls that you might use to comply with the new requirements, you might be already implementing those to comply with existing requirements in the permit. So that's something to consider. Like I mentioned, there are a number of input factors that go into a cost calculation for a facility. So because our general permit is a general permit, it's not an individual permit, so we don't necessarily know who our permittees are going to be ahead of time. We know a number of facilities continue their permit coverage from before, but we can't necessarily predict exactly who's going to seek coverage under our permit because of the way the general permit is structured. Other things to consider for this general permit are that it applies in multiple places across the country. You know, it's not just in a specific state. It covers many parts of the country, many different types of soils, precipitation patterns, climates, labor costs, things like that, which vary from area to area and facility to facility. We also don't necessarily know which types of BMPs and stormwater control measures each facility has already implemented or will implement to comply with the permit. So not to go on, but just to give you an idea of the number of factors that would go into the calculation. So where we could cost out a proposed permit requirement, we did, and where there are unknown factors that we can't necessarily calculate that would be facility specific, we've given the variables that one might use to calculate that total cost. The other thing is that the requirements, as I mentioned, are not uniform across facilities. So if you're not a sector that is getting new benchmark monitoring, sector-specific benchmark monitoring, then that cost wouldn't matter to you. And so trying to average out a cost for an average facility becomes very complex. Also, as many of you know, discharge points and pollutants vary across different facilities. In the analysis, I found that our MSGP facilities have as little as 1 discharge point, as many as up to almost 60. So the cost definitely will vary depending on how many discharge points you have and pollutants in your industrial activity. So as I mentioned, the proposed permit is out for public comment. It's currently at a 60-day comment period. We encourage everyone to look at the permit and submit comments to the docket. This is the EPA docket number, and I did just want to try to see if I can bring this up and show you guys a little bit what the docket looks like if you're not familiar with it. As you can see, I was searching for a bear to add to my slide earlier. So this is the docket. If you're not familiar, it's on regulations.gov, and you can, here is the docket ID number. You can either use the link that I provided on the slide, or you can go to regulations.gov and search for this docket ID number, or you can search by the title. It's sort of like Google, so you can find it that way. This is the layout of the docket. The primary documents is a little bit of a misnomer. This is not where the permit itself is. This is where the Federal Register notice is, and that's where you would click to comment. The supporting documents is where all of the proposed permit and fact sheet, all of the record is located. So this is where you're going to find the actual documents, not in the primary documents. And then we have received 7 comments so far. So once you submit a public comment, it's processed and posted here. I also wanted to show you our EPA website. Actually, this is the website that I wanted to show you. This is the page for stormwater discharges associated with industrial activity. We actually have a alert on all of our pages now due to the increased use of masks and gloves. I'm just going to take this time to give highlight that for a second. We're seeing a lot of gloves and masks on the ground, so make sure to use the trash can for those. So actually on the website, if you go to our Industrial Stormwater website under the proposed 2020 MSGP tab, we have information here as well. So we have a link to the settlement agreement that I was discussing at the beginning of the presentation. There's a link to the National Academies study that is downloadable for free. I think that you have to register your email. So you can go here that says download PDF. I think it makes you register your email, but it is free. You can download it. So there's a link to that. There's also a link back to the docket. So if you can't access the docket or can't find it through regulations.gov, you can look for it on here. We have a number of the primary permit files linked to our website here. Again, everything is in the docket itself, but on our website, we have the main documents, the FR notice, the permit appendices, fact sheet, and the cost analysis, and then another link to the docket. If you scroll down the page, we had information about our webcasts. This is the previous webcast that we had on March 10th. So if you're interested in going back to that one, it covered the same content, but the Q&As might be of interest to you. And then at the bottom of our page, we have a summary of proposed changes in the permit. This is also in the fact sheet and Federal Register notice, but it's also on our website. So it could be a really useful guide for you to think about the significant proposed changes in the permit. So it outlines what the change is and then gives a reference to where it is in the permit and the request for comment number that it's associated with. So it details, the website details all of that. And then a little bit farther down on the webpage is our additional requests for public comment. Like I said, in addition to the proposed changes, we had a number of requests for comment. So again, it details what it is and then references the part of the permit and the request for comment number it's associated with. A lot of the proposed changes have requests for comment associated with them as well. So not to confuse you, these proposed changes do have some requests for comment, but these here are strictly just requests for comment. Hopefully that's not too confusing. That's pretty much the end of my presentation. I will post the slides on the website because I do have a number of appendix slides. I'm not actually going to go through them right now, but I'll click through them. It talks about the MSGP litigation, the timeline of that. Also goes into what's in the settlement agreement. And then the remainder of the slides talk about the National Academies study, the NRC study, and it highlights the recommendations from that and which ones that we pulled into the permit, highlighted there in the orange. So I'm not going to go through those in detail, but I did want to make sure that folks knew about those slides, and they'll be posted on the website if they're interested in going through them. So let me look at the time. We have about 15 minutes left for questions. So I thought we might go over time, but we're still in our time period for 2:30. So I think we'll take questions for about 15 minutes. And I'm going to pause, take a drink of water, and see if my colleagues are going to get online, and we'll start the Q&A.
Hi, Emily. This is Caitlin. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Caitlin.
Hey. So we got some good questions today. The first one is, can impaired waters monitoring automatically stop after 3 years if pollutants are not detected? Or will permittees need to submit a change NOI to remove the impacted waters requirement after the 3 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm just going to try to flip to the slide that's related to the question as much as I can, so folks can have some context. I think the answer is that they can stop monitoring. They may have to submit a change NOI to notify EPA that they have complied with this requirement. But one thing that we're trying to do with our NPDES e-reporting tool system and NetDMR, if you guys are familiar with that, which I'm sure you are, it's where permittees submit your monitoring results. We're trying to implement some changes with the system to make it more proactive when you submit your monitoring results. We're trying to code and program into those systems so that the systems know what your monitoring requirements are, so that when you submit your results, it will be able to calculate, okay, this permittee has submitted the 3 required annual samples for impaired waters monitoring. The samples are, non-existent, or, they've complied with their requirements, and so the system would automatically then discontinue those monitoring requirements. That's not something that we have implemented right now, but that's something that we're trying to do to make things more streamlined for all of our facilities. So stay tuned. As of now, a change NOI would be required because that triggers our EPA regions to manually go in and change those monitoring requirements for the facilities.
Great, thank you, Emily. Are benchmark limit violations enforceable as penalties?
Good question. So the answer is no. Benchmark monitoring requirements and benchmark thresholds are not considered effluent limitation guidelines. We're very explicit about that, and so exceedance of benchmark thresholds is not considered a violation of the permit. It's not the same as an ELG. However, an exceedance of a benchmark indicates there's a problem, right? And so not addressing a benchmark exceedance and not complying with the new AIM process would be considered a violation of the permit, because the permittee is required to take some follow-up action. So the exceedance itself is not a permit violation. Failing to respond to an exceedance is a violation.
That makes sense. Thanks, Emily. In part 4.2.4.1, do you consider
Caitlin, are you there? Hang tight, folks. We may have lost her. Just give us 1 second.
Emily, this is Rachel Urban. I'm gonna have to pick up because we just lost electricity at Caitlin's. So give me 1 moment so that I can figure out exactly where we are in the questioning. Sorry about that.
Okay, no worries. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, sorry, folks. Like I said, bear with us because we're all remote and we're still trying to figure everything out over the internet. So we'll get back to our questions just a second. Thanks, Rachel.
Okay, I think I'm back. I'm not sure exactly which question Caitlin was on, but I found another one. What happens if you sample more than quarterly? What can happen since it may bring down the average, but a single sample can be still 4 times over?
Can you read the question again, Rachel? As
Sure
I flip to the AIM.
So the question is, what happens if you sample more than just quarterly? And it's related to if you sample more frequently, your average may be brought down, but you could still have a single sample that is 4 times over. Would that change the outcome?
No, so facilities are required to sample at least those 4 times. If they have additional monitoring data, they can include that. But if you have a single sample that is 4 times the benchmark, the additional samples wouldn't necessarily matter, because the trigger, one of the triggers, it's not just the annual average. There's also a concentration-based trigger. So if you have additional samples out here that lower your average, if you do have that one sample that's 4 times over the benchmark, that would still trigger the AIM Tier 1.
Okay, so the next question, let's see. Is there currently a list or a preliminary list of specific facilities that are considered low risk? Same question for light manufacturing. Is there a list?
Yeah, so I think this probably is in relation to the inspection only option. So we don't necessarily have an existing list of who are the low risk facilities. For light manufacturing, if you actually look in 40 CFR 122.26 D14, there is a list of what is considered light manufacturing. Light manufacturing has specific SIC codes associated with it. So what we did for our analysis is we looked at the existing NOI data, and we identified the facilities that had the light manufacturing SIC codes, and we counted up how many facilities would be accounted for with this categorization. But we don't have a list of what type of sectors or facilities we would consider low risk, because we're still looking for input about what those criteria might be to be able to categorize them in a way that makes sense and that really does identify them as low risk. We do have a no exposure checklists, and obviously facilities that are, in the no exposure exclusion category are fairly low risk, but that's an exclusion from permit coverage. So we're trying to see, okay, what's the category above the no exposure? There are facilities that do need permit coverage, they're required to get permit coverage, but they have a lower risk of water quality concerns, a lower risk of pollutant discharge than other facilities. So we don't have a complete list, and we're really looking for input on how we would identify those facilities.
Great, thank you, Emily. Another question is, other than the construction general permit for stormwater discharges from construction sites, what other NPDES permits require signage?
So I know that some CSO permits do require signage for their outfalls. I don't have a complete list of all the facilities that are required to have a sign at their site, but I know a number of them do, and in particular those construction general permits and CSO permittees. Rachel, I'm not sure if you know of other facilities that do have that requirement, and sometimes it can be written into the individual permit.
No, that's the only one that comes to mind off the top of my head as well. It doesn't mean that there aren't other ones out there, but right now I can't think of any others. A general question about follow-up. Is there an email listserv that will provide periodic updates or alerts on the proposed permit?
We don't have one specific to the MSGP. If folks want to sign up for NPDES News, that's one where we announce a lot of our information. So let me see if I can just bring it up. If you just search for NPDES News and you click on our homepage, I believe there's a link to the listserv. So if you scroll all the way down, let me make sure everyone can see what I'm looking at. Yeah. So on our webpage, which is it's epa.gov/NPDES, you can go down to the bottom right and click Join NPDES News. That's probably what I would recommend to folks. And you can just enter your email and click Sign Up. So you'll get other NPDES updates. We don't have one specific for the MSGP, so this is what I would recommend.
Thanks, Emily. I know we've got a couple minutes for a few other questions, it seems. Are the control measures that are listed in Section 2 of the draft permit applicable to facilities which have an NOI under the permit, but not required at those with a conditional exclusion under Section 1.5, which is the no exposure certification section?
So I might be misunderstanding the question, but if the facility has an exclusion for no exposure, that means that they don't need permit coverage. So it's an exclusion from the stormwater requirements for industrial stormwater discharges. So facilities that have an NEC, it's not the same as an NOI. They're not seeking permit coverage under the MSGP. They're seeking an exclusion from getting permit coverage. So therefore, there aren't additional control measures that they would have to comply with in Part 2. The permit itself is only applicable to facilities that are covered under the permit. So if there's an exclusion, you really just go through the no exposure checklist. Let me see if I can find the slide where I talked about that. And you fill that out online, you submit that, and that's pretty much all you have to do at that point. If there's something that changes on your site where your activities are now exposed to stormwater, you would immediately need to seek coverage under the permit by submitting an NOI.
Great, thanks, Emily. Another question, do I understand correctly that it is being considered that qualified inspectors would need to be a PE or a PG? If so, is that included in the estimated incremental cost calculation?
Good question. So I can definitely make a clarification. For inspections under the permit, the regular inspections, it's not for a PE. So the regular inspections that are required by every facility, the self-inspection, that just needs to be a qualified personnel. And qualified personnel is somebody that has the knowledge and experience to evaluate, the effectiveness and maintenance of stormwater control measures. It's not required to be a PE. What we're talking about here with this inspection only option is different, and it's in addition to those self-inspections. So this inspection only option is a more rigorous, comprehensive, professional inspection conducted by a third party that would come onto the site and do an evaluation of the site in lieu of benchmark monitoring. That's what we're requesting comment on and considering to have that inspector be a PE, just to make sure that they do have some type of credential to conduct this more rigorous and comprehensive inspection. It's like the inspector being a PE is not something we're proposing per se. It was just one option. So that's why on this slide, one of the puzzle pieces I have is figuring out what the professional inspector credential should be. Is a PE a good benchmark? Is it too rigorous? That's why we're seeking input on this. So the regular inspections that are required under the permit, this is not applicable to them.
Thanks, Emily. And I see another question in here that I had missed earlier, where someone was asking what PE was, and I can't remember if you said that at the beginning or not. It's a professional engineer.
Yes. Thanks, Rachel.
No problem. I'm just going to ask two other quick questions just in the interest of time, since I know it is right now 2:30. Can you comment on facilities that are in semi-arid areas that may have difficulty collecting benchmark samples, much less trying to get quarterly or any samples at all?
Yeah, I know that arid facilities in arid areas have very unique challenges. And so there are flexibilities under the existing permit, and they'll continue under the proposed permit for those facilities. If you're unable to collect monitoring data, we have an option in our system to enter a no data code. I think we call it a no-D code. So you would just enter that code, say that you were unable to collect due to lack of precipitation. I think there are requirements in the permit to document those specific arid, the time periods for beginning and ending of drought and things like that you would have to document in your SWIP. But there are flexibilities for those facilities throughout the permit.
Great. And I know just to wrap it up with a question that some of you may wonder about and that was asked, I know that there are some requests for extension that have been submitted. Are there any decisions on that as of yet?
No, like I mentioned, we did receive 4 requests for extension of the comment period, and the agency is considering those. Right now, we don't have a decision yet. We might be able to announce something in the next coming weeks. If we do decide to extend the comment period, my recommendation to folks is at this time period, our comment deadline is May 1st. So, I encourage you to get the comments in and work on them, assuming that the deadline will be May 1st. And we would let everyone know as soon as possible once a decision is made about extending the comment period.
Thanks, Emily. So I think with that, we will close out the webinar. I want to thank everyone for attending today. The previous webinar, as Emily had mentioned earlier, is available right now on our website. If you have any issues trying to access it, I suggest you try a different internet browser potentially, but I was able to access it earlier today, so please feel free to go there. And thank you again for listening and joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.